Territories developed into states. In 1792, Kentucky was the first Western territory to become a state. Tennessee became a state in 1796. That meant that each had a population of at least 60,000. They were no longer the frontier. Settlement of the Northwest Territory had moved so fast that in 1803, Ohio had a population of over 60,000 and became a state. Indiana achieved statehood in 1816, and Illinois followed in 1818. Those three states were the next to go. Southerners moved west into what are now the states of Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. The first group to move into the area were small pioneer families, as described earlier. In the South, however, wealthy plantation owners also moved west from the Carolinas and Virginia. They bought large portions of river bottom land and brought slaves to grow cotton. Because the large rivers flowed through rich farmland, they could settle along the river and easily ship their cash crops to New Orleans. Slaves were a large part of the population in the area that became Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. The sale of cotton became a major part of the economy of that region. By the 1820s, New Orleans had the largest cotton exporting city in the United States. Under the Three-Fifths Compromise in the Constitution, slaves were counted as part of the population, and soon the three territories had enough settlers, slave and free, to become states. Although Louisiana was further west than Mississippi and Alabama, Louisiana became a state first in 1812. Louisiana had more people because it contained the city of New Orleans. Mississippi became a state in 1817, and Alabama followed in 1819. Florida becomes part of the United States. In the 1500s, Spain claimed Florida when the Spanish first explored that area. Before the War of 1812, many individuals in the United States wanted the United States to take over ownership of Florida. Slave owners in Georgia complained that runaway slaves crossed over into Florida to escape from their owners, and that Native Americans from Florida were raiding settlements in the United States. Florida was owned by Spain, and neither the U.S. Army nor American citizens were supposed to enter Florida for any reason. In the 1800s, Spain was not a powerful country. Several times the United States Army entered Florida illegally. Once, the Army entered Florida to attack a fort controlled by runaway slaves. In 1818, the U.S. Army, under the command of General Andrew Jackson, pursued the Seminoles, a Native American tribe, into Florida. When the Army was not able to capture the Native Americans' leader, General Jackson ordered the Army to occupy or take over Pensacola, the capital of Florida, to use as a base for military operations. Spain was not strong enough to stop the United States Army. Spain complained to the United States, but President James Monroe argued that taking Pensacola was necessary to protect U.S. citizens. In 1819, Spain finally agreed to give Florida to the United States. In exchange, the United States canceled $5 million that the U.S. said was owed to it by Spain. Three factors attract Americans to the western frontier. Go west, young man. In 1846, a newspaper editor in New York named Horace Greeley wrote an article with advice to young men who were looking to improve themselves economically. Greeley said that if they did not have a wealthy family to help them in the East, they should move to the West to set up their homes and to make their fortunes, because there was more opportunity in the West. Greeley's advice became very popular and was shortened to "Go West, young man." Thousands of Americans took his suggestions to heart and moved west. The following section tells about three factors that attracted Americans to the western frontier. Reason number one, freedom of religion, a people's rights problem. Individuals move to solve religious and economic problems. Later sections will discuss the economic problems. This section addresses religious problems. The solution to people's rights problems was to get away from other people and establish their own way of life. That process began with Roger Williams, Anne Hutchinson, and others who established new colonies to get away from the Puritans. People continued to move to obtain religious freedom well into the 1800s. Moving for religious freedom. People in the United States were given freedom to practice their religion in the Bill of Rights. However, just because religious freedom was guaranteed in the Bill of Rights did not mean that all people could practice their religion without angering some of their neighbors. In the same way that some early colonists gained religious freedom by moving from England and other European countries to the United States in the 1600s and early 1700s, some United States citizens had to move west to find religious freedom in the 1840s. Mormons, an example of moving for religious freedom in the 1840s. Mormonism is a religion that was started in western New York State in the 1820s by a man named Joseph Smith. Mormonism grew rapidly, but it also had many enemies. In 1830, Joseph Smith published the Book of Mormon, which contains Mormon spiritual teachings. Because many Protestants in New York were annoyed by some of the practices of the Mormons, especially their belief that a man could have several wives, they attacked Joseph Smith. For protection, the Mormons moved to Illinois, founded a city, built a temple, and started a university. The Mormons were attacked again by local Protestant mobs, and in 1844 Joseph Smith was killed by a mob. The Mormons decided to move to the western frontier to escape religious persecution. At that time, the frontier had skipped over the Great Plains and had moved beyond the political borders of the United States. The Mormons moved to land that was owned by Mexico. In 1846, 15,000 of them moved west. You can see the trail here. The Mormons set up irrigation systems, farms, and a city in the valley of the Great Salt Lakes. The city they founded is now called Salt Lake City, Utah. The Mormons are an example of moving to gain religious freedom in the 1840s. Reason 2. Land helps solve economic problems. Because of the population growth, there was not enough land in the original 13 states to allow everyone to own a farm, and there were not enough high paying jobs for young people and new immigrants to make a living in the cities. Land. Many people decided they could solve their economic problem by moving out west. On the frontier, land was easier to get. In some places, land could be bought cheaply. In other places, people were able to get land for free by simply settling on it. Squatters was the name given to people who acquired land by moving onto it before anyone else had legally established ownership. By owning their own land, people hoped to be able to solve their economic problems. Natural resources. Some people were able to solve their economic problems by taking claim to and making use of natural resources on the frontier. Some mined precious metals, while others trapped animals for their fur.